She was a face that could slip into a crowd and still be noticed. A background actress, a young mother, a presence small enough to be overlooked and luminous enough to be photographed. In photographs, she smiles with the practiced ease of someone who has learned to shape hope for the camera. In the newspapers, her name arrived in short, factual lines. Missing. Last seen, no ransom. The city that built fantasies from celluloid now held one it could not explain. On an October night in 1949, she walked out of an apartment and into an absence that would not close. Her car remained, her purse stayed behind. A scrap of paper and a hurried note were found, and then silence stretched farther than the headlines. In a town accustomed to reinvention, her disappearance refused to be rewritten. It resisted the neat endings Hollywood preferred. It left a question with too many faces and no answer that fit. This is not a story of scandal for its own sake. It is a story of light and shadow, of a life arranged in small, precise gestures, smiles for the camera, errands in the afternoon, whispered appointments, and then a sudden interruption that turned ordinary details into clues and rumors into architecture. The city's glow hid its edges. Behind the marquee, behind the flashbulbs and the polite applause, there was a quiet that swallowed a young woman whole. The mystery that followed would gather names, whispers, and half-truths. It would bend toward the powerful and the invisible, toward doctors' offices and backlot corridors, toward men whose reputations could blunt the edges of inquiry. For decades, the echoes of that night would haunt reporters and family alike. In the bright history of Hollywood, a small, vanished life kept insisting on being remembered.
Before she became a headline, before her name was whispered in back rooms of studios and police stations, Jean Elizabeth Spangler was just a girl from Seattle, raised on daydreams and Pacific fog. Her family moved to Los Angeles when she was still a child, a city swelling with opportunity and with illusions that could consume the unprepared. Jean wasn't born into privilege or pedigree. She came from ordinary soil, the kind that Hollywood rarely celebrates, working class, uncertain, full of small ambitions. But even in that simplicity, there was something radiant about her. Classmates remembered her as the girl who smiled like she already knew she'd be famous. In her teenage years, Jean danced for local productions, took any chance to perform, to be seen. A chorus girl, a background silhouette in parades, an extra on film sets that barely noticed her name. She didn't crave luxury, she craved recognition, the kind that told her she mattered in a world that only applauded the extraordinary. But dreams in Los Angeles came with a cost. When she married young, at just 19, it was not for glamour, but for escape. The marriage fractured, leaving Jean a single mother, raising her daughter Christine while chasing casting calls between shifts and rent payments. By 1948, she had already lived several lives: the dancer, the wife, the mother, the dreamer. Her face began appearing in film stills, blurry and distant, somewhere in the background, but she believed each frame brought her closer to the light. And maybe that was what made her so vulnerable. Because in a city where ambition could shine brighter than reason, Jean's hunger for something more, even just a little more, was the one thing Hollywood knew how to exploit best. She wasn't a star, a friend once said, but she had that look, that kind of look that made you think she could be. It was that almost quality that made her story so haunting. A life right on the edge of becoming, before it was swallowed by the night.
By 1948, Jean Spangler had become a familiar face on studio backlots. Not a star, not even a credited performer most days, but part of that invisible architecture that kept the dream of Hollywood alive. She worked as an extra on films that would go on to define post-war cinema. When My Baby Smiles at Me, 1948, Chicken Every Sunday, 1949, and finally, Young Man with a Horn, starring a man whose name would later be tied to her disappearance, Kirk Douglas. To most, Jean was the working girl with a camera-ready smile, one of hundreds chasing a sliver of light through a system that fed on beauty and desperation in equal measure.
She learned how to move through the set quietly. The assistant director's call, the costume changes, the cigarette breaks between takes. It was a small life orbiting large stars, but in her journal she wrote of wanting more, of roles that spoke instead of smiled. Hollywood in 1949 was still shaking off the ash of war. Men in suits ran studios like fiefdoms, and women like Jean were the currency, easily replaced, easily forgotten. Yet her friends said she knew people, the kind of people who could make a phone call and change everything. Some said she had been seeing a man with influence. Others whispered about producers, actors, and doctors. There was a restlessness in her near the end. A friend remembered how she'd talk about a big opportunity coming soon. She had just finished a small part. Maybe something more was waiting. Maybe she had finally stepped close enough to be seen. But beneath that hope was something darker, fear maybe, or anticipation. She told a fellow dancer she was meeting someone who could fix things. No one knew what she meant, and in the days that followed, no one would ever know for sure. Hollywood was a labyrinth of whispers and closed doors. Behind the spotlight, shadows were thicker, more deliberate, and Jean, with her trusting heart and determined smile, walked straight into them. She was right there, one extra later said. One moment she's waiting for a cue, the next she's gone, like a scene that was never filmed. In the final days before her disappearance, Jean had touched the edges of success. But the cost of climbing higher in that world was often invisible, until it wasn't. It was a Friday evening, October 7, 1949. Los Angeles wrapped in its usual glow of headlights and gossip. Jean Spangler left her apartment in the Park La Brea district, wearing a white blouse and tight blue slacks, telling her sister-in-law she had 2 errands to run. First, to meet her ex-husband about overdue child support, and then to head to the studio for a night shoot. She never came home. The next morning, her purse was found in Griffith Park, one strap torn, lying in the dust like a misplaced memory. Inside was her ID, some makeup, and a handwritten note. The note read, "Kirk, can't wait any longer. Going to see Dr. Scott. It will work best this way while Mother is away." Her handwriting was hers, rushed, uneven, unfinished. And that was the last trace of Jean Spangler anyone would ever find. The investigation began quietly, then spiraled into chaos. Detectives interviewed her ex-husband, Dexter Benner, who denied seeing her that night. They questioned friends, co-workers, men she dated. No one knew who Kirk was, not for sure. Douglas was in Palm Springs filming Young Man with a Horn when Jean vanished, or so he said. When reporters reached him, he admitted to knowing her slightly, said she was a nice girl, and offered to cooperate. The press devoured the coincidence. It was the perfect headline: a rising star, a missing woman, a cryptic note addressed to Kirk. Then came the second mystery, Dr. Scott. No such doctor could be found in Los Angeles under that name, but whispers began to surface about underground abortionists, operating in secret at a time when the procedure was illegal and deadly. Some believed Jean was pregnant, possibly by someone powerful. Others believed she knew too much or had seen something she shouldn't have. Griffith Park itself became an open wound of speculation. Search parties combed through its ravines, dogs sniffed through the brush, volunteers shouted her name into the wind. Nothing. No body, no struggle, no sound, as if the city had simply swallowed her whole. And then, silence. The tabloids moved on. The police had no leads. Hollywood kept shining. But her friends remembered the unease in her voice days before she disappeared, the tension behind her smile, the way she clutched her purse tighter, the pauses between her sentences. She looked scared, one of them said later, like she was walking towards something she couldn't turn away from. The city of illusions had claimed another soul, and this time, even its storytellers couldn't invent an ending.
The police called it a missing persons case, but Hollywood called it something else, a cover-up. As the weeks passed and no trace of Jean emerged, the story began to twist in ways only Hollywood could conjure. Rumors seeped into newspaper columns like cigarette smoke, soft, toxic, untraceable. The first theory pointed toward Kirk Douglas. Reporters noted the unfinished note to Kirk and the timing of her appearance as an extra in his film Young Man with a Horn. Douglas insisted he barely knew her, claiming he'd been away when she vanished. The police confirmed his alibi, and the story should have ended there. But gossip has its own gravity, and in post-war Hollywood, stars were gods, their sins untouchable, their scandals erased before dawn. The second theory crept darker: Dr. Scott. That name, scribbled in Jean's note, led detectives through a maze of whispers: back alley clinics, private residences, doctors without licenses. Abortion in 1949 was not just taboo, it was criminal. Women who sought help did so in shadows, often never to be heard from again. Some believed Jean was pregnant, possibly by a married man, maybe someone famous. Others said she'd confided that something had gone wrong and she needed to fix it before it's too late.
But there was a third path, one that stretched beyond Hollywood's lights and into the city's underbelly. Jean's friends claimed she'd been spending time with a man named Davy Ogle, rumored to have connections with the mob. Ogle disappeared 2 days after Jean. Police suspected he'd fled to Texas to escape indictment, or maybe, like Jean, he'd vanished into the same quiet grave. It was the perfect cocktail of mystery: a Hollywood actress, a cryptic note, a movie star, a gangster, a doctor who didn't exist. And through it all, the silence of the studios was deafening. No one wanted the headlines to grow teeth, not in an industry where image was money and the wrong question could end a career. Behind the curtain, whispers grew darker that Jean's death had been arranged, her disappearance cleaned up by men who owned both the cameras and the cops. There were mentions of contracts, favors, debts, and of a system that protected the powerful and erased the disposable. Hollywood doesn't bury its mistakes, a journalist once said. It edits them out. The deeper investigators dug, the more they realized there was no single story left to find, only fragments, only fiction dressed as fact. And in those fragments, Jean Spangler became a ghost not of death, but of silence, a symbol of how easily a woman could vanish in a city built on her image.
Dawn rises over Griffith Park, pale and indifferent, the same light that fell on the search parties 75 years ago. The city has changed, but the silence here still feels familiar. The wind hums through the trees, and for a moment, it sounds like someone calling her name. Jean Spangler never came home. No body was ever found, no confession, no headline that closed the story. The case remains open, a file aging quietly in the archives of the LAPD. But her disappearance outlived the investigation. It became something else, a mirror held up to Hollywood's heart, showing what the camera never did. For a city built on illusions, Jean's vanishing was the one illusion it couldn't control. A woman who didn't fit the script, too hopeful to be cynical, too real to be rewritten. She didn't die on screen, so Hollywood pretended she had never existed. The tabloids forgot her name. The stars she once stood behind went on to win awards, to age into legends. Yet her story, quietly, persisted. In documentaries, in cold case files, in the corners of the internet where forgotten faces resurface for a moment and then fade again.
There's something cruelly poetic about it. How a woman who wanted only to be seen became famous by disappearing. How the city of light and reinvention turned her into a ghost that never left its frame. Somewhere, a friend once said, Jean is still waiting for her close-up. Only this time, the camera never stopped rolling. As the morning burns through the haze, the skyline of Los Angeles gleams like a reel of film ready to be rewritten. But no script could ever capture what happened to her, the quiet terror, the unfinished note, the way her smile still lingers in black and white photographs, fragile as a memory that refuses to fade. In the mythology of Hollywood, some stars rise, some fall, and some, like Jean Spangler, simply vanish, leaving only a question that time cannot answer. Fade to black. The screen hums with static. Somewhere in the distance, the city keeps pretending it never saw her go.